Wired.com presents The Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. And here is your host, David Barr Kirtley.
Hello, and welcome to episode 108 of Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. Today on the show, Bible scholars Robert M. Price and Richard Carrier will be joining us to discuss the recent Darren Aronofsky film Noah. But first up, we've got an interview with best-selling humor novelist Christopher Moore. His latest book is called The Serpent of Venice. And now, here's our interview with Christopher Moore. All right, so we're here with Christopher Moore. Welcome to the show.
Thanks.
Okay, so your new book is called The Serpent of Venice, and it features the return of your character Pocket, who first appeared in your 2009 novel Fool. So tell us about Pocket.
Well, Pocket is based on the Fool from King Lear. Anybody who's familiar with King Lear knows that the Fool sort of just disappears more or less in the middle of the play, and but otherwise he's pretty prominent, and of all of Shakespeare's fools anyway, he sort of is the one who speaks the most truth to power. You know, he's in the most actual danger for being a fool, which was what I was going for, and I had originally just wanted to do a book about any fool, a generic fool, because of that very reason, that truth to power. And my editor, I met with her in New York and said, look, I want to do a book about a fool, but I don't know whether to do just any fool or Lear's fool. And she said, oh, do Lear's fool, which, you know, sent me into 3 years of learning Shakespeare's canon. And Pocket is he's tiny. He was raised in a nunnery, and he's extraordinarily foul-mouthed. And so not only is he politically not very powerful, but he refers to himself physically as a bit of a soggy kitten. So he's there's that contrast of him being very, very articulate and sort of the master of any conversation because he's so witty, but pretty much being the least powerful character on stage at any time.
Mm-hmm. I mean, so when you say that he's foul-mouthed, could you give us an idea of what are the sorts of things that he might be prone to say?
God, I love the internet. If this was radio, you'd be standing on the delay button. Well, I mean, when I wrote this, I wanted to use a lot of British slang, and the Brits are much more free with words like twat and the C word and you know, bloody buggering bollocks and a word that I coined, fuck stockings, and that sort of thing. So at any given time, he will go off on sort of an obscene rant at any given character. He calls King Lear in the first book, he calls him dog fuckingly old, and in this book, it's just that's sort of his mentality, and it really would have been how fools in the Middle Ages would have behaved. You know, they were not. They may have been very smart and very quick, but they were not high-minded, and the sense of humor was not high-minded. So that's about the best I can do off the top of my head. But there's profanity all over the place in this book.
Mm. Okay, and so you mentioned that Fool is sort of your take on King Lear. And now this book it's sort of a mashup of Shakespeare's plays Othello and The Merchant of Venice, and the Edgar Allan Poe short story The Cask of Amontillado. Just how did you get the idea to combine those particular stories?
Well, essentially, I started with the premise. I was in Venice. I had gone to the Mantua Literary Festival to do an appearance, and stopped over in Venice, and just wandering through the city, I thought, this is the perfect setting for a monster story. And then I always, you know, make a note of everything because you never know when something's going to be an idea that can develop. And so when it came time to come up with the idea for a new book, I thought, well, maybe I could set a monster story in Venice. And you always try to, or I always try to see what stories have been told that are set in Venice before, because you don't want to sort of step on someone's toes. And, you know, immediately I thought of a horror story set in Venice is The Cask of Amontillado, wherein a fool is walled up in a dungeon. And I thought, well, I have a fool. And then I thought, well, what Shakespeare plays are set in Venice, and it's The Merchant of Venice and Othello. Then there's always got to be some weird supernatural, you know, thing going on, and therefore the serpent. And so I was just trying to figure out how to make all those elements come together, and history really worked in my advantage because I had set Fool in the late 13th century, the end of the 12s. And what was happening in Venice in the late 13th century was really interesting. And politically, the Venetians had made a lot of money by being the facilitator for the Crusades. They really, became the power of the Mediterranean because they could ship soldiers and goods and weapons to the Holy Land. And so in the Fourth Crusade, at the beginning of the 13th century, they really became a maritime power. And so there were a lot of things going on that resonated sort of with our time, with, wars in the Middle East being, sort of perpetrated by people who were going to make money on them, as well as the element of a black general, a black Moorish general who was the head of a navy and a military force that was about to go to war against a Muslim force, and then a Jewish moneylender. So to have all of those things in one story in that time period really was sort of the best of all worlds when you're trying to foment conflict.
Mm. Well, yeah, I mean, why don't you talk a little bit about what sorts of changes you had to make to the respective stories, even just to fit them into the same chronology, right?
Well, yeah, they both are sort of set. Shakespeare doesn't give a specific time, but if you look at the events that he mentions particularly in Othello, it's happening in about mid 16th century because that's when the Venetians were at war with the Turks, and that's where Othello is as the general is sent to Cyprus to fight the Turks, Cyprus and Rhodes, I think, and so setting it 250 years earlier changes that quite a bit. And the at that point, the Venetians are at war with the Genoans, and toward the end of the 12th century, their navy is almost completely wiped out by the Genoan navy, down to like 40 ships. And if you're the maritime power of the Mediterranean, that's really not enough ships. And so I was able to take, one wonders, how does this Moor, this outsider, become the general? And I was able to explain that, in that he was hired as a mercenary, and he sort of distinguished himself in defending the city of Venice, because in that war, Venice, the main islands were never attacked. The Genoans, they were able to hold the Genoans off. Otherwise, Venice would have fallen. And so I just give that credit to Othello. By the same token, taking The Merchant of Venice, which sort of focuses on the merchant world of Venice and this moneylender Shylock, I was able to, move that into the 13th century. And Jews had been sort of persecuted in Europe back to, the first century. So that's sort of a theme that you're going to have in any play or anything that you set, and you have Jewish people in it. But it was a bit harsher in the 13th century than it is in Shakespeare's 16th century, and so moving, Shylock to be a moneylender at the time when there's a holy war with the Muslims, I just thought there was a great conflict going there, and making the plots work together. It wasn't as hard. It was difficult. There was a lot of sort of sliding pieces, but I don't think that's very interesting to talk about. The fun thing was that there's an enormous number of characters. I think there's 38 named characters in the two plays, and that's way too long for a comic novel, way too many. But as I started to see who could I cut and who could I keep, you can see that Shakespeare's writing for a troupe of actors, because you go, oh, well, obviously whoever played Portia is also Desdemona, and whoever played um, Antonio is also Iago. And so in each of the plays, there's sort of a counter character that would pretty obviously be performed by the same person. And so in many of those cases, I was able to make those characters a single person.
Well, so you said that Venice is a perfect city for a monster story. Like, what is it about Venice that makes it so perfect for monsters?
Well, it's very old, and some of the streets are so narrow that um, you literally, or I literally have to turn sideways to get through so my shoulders don't, and I'm not an enormous guy, so my shoulders don't hit either side. And yet it's a marked street and the buildings are buttressed to keep from caving in on each other at the top. And then there's these wellheads everywhere you go because Venice is, you know, often below sea level. The freshwater wellheads are these sort of raised um, concrete things or brick things that are, and then some of them are as high as 6 foot tall, and they have these big iron lids on top of them, and that's so when Venice floods every winter, when tourists aren't there, the salt water doesn't get into their freshwater supply, and I just thought, well, something creepy's going to come out of there for sure, and the idea that if there was something in the water, it could go anywhere in the city unseen and then just sort of pop up, attack somebody, and then be gone again, and no one would, because the water in the canals of Venice is not clear. I mean, you can't see 6 inches underneath the water there. So that was really what made it so creepy, and it sort of maintains this Byzantine medieval look to the city. It doesn't really, even though it's sort of most of what's left was built in the Renaissance because of there was a point where Venice was part of the Byzantine Empire, or basically owned the Byzantine Empire because they took Constantinople. Um, and that part of the architecture sort of maintains there that you don't find in other Italian cities. So it's just that sort of, it's a city of water. And if you're going to have a monster in the water, he could get around pretty well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the monster could show up anywhere. So for example, the book opens kind of with this scene we mentioned out of Poe's Cask of Amontillado, where Pocket is chained to a wall, and except in your version, this monster comes up out of the water and performs sex acts on him. How did you come up with that idea?
Interesting. I mean, years ago, this is what happens. This is why you never throw anything away as far as ideas go. I'm a hoarder as far as notebooks go. Years ago, a woman named Michelle Schlung asked me to contribute a story to an anthology she was doing of just that, of sexy horror stories. And I came up with the idea of a guy who was chained in a dungeon that the tide came in and out of, and that something had come into the water and uh, which he couldn't see. It was dark in the dungeon, and because his arms were chained to the wall, and it sort of got him off to just to be quick about it. And I thought, well, that would be, and then at the end of that story, he realizes that this is just a baby creature in the water, and that it's going to grow teeth. And that's the end of the story. It's like, dun, dun, dun. And I never wrote the story. And I had a nice exchange with the editor, with Michelle Schlung. And I said, I was on deadline for a book, and I said, I don't have time to do this. I don't know if it's even a good idea. But when I started writing, about a fool being walled up in a dungeon, I thought, that's really not enough. And I want a monster in this. And so that's what made it occur to me, was just sort of going back to my old notes from like the late 90s for a short story that I'd never written.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I'd sort of imagine that when you start off a book with interspecies bondage sex, you expect to maybe lose a few readers. Do you think that's the case?
Don't care. The way I look at it is I mean, there's really a genre now that I had to be told there was, of monster sex. In that whole paranormal romance thing, there's a lot of inner monster boning going on. and I have been told this because I'm sort of on the edge of that. I did a series of vampire books I had started in like 1994, before evidently vampires were a thing. And it was just sort of normal people trying to date a vampire, and dealing with normal lifetime things like, who does the laundry, and wait, I don't use toilet paper, why should I have to buy toilet paper? And that sort of stuff. And I just wanted the whole comic aspect of it. But I picked up this audience, probably about, the mid O's, about 2004, 2005, of these romance people. And having not been to that section of the bookstore, I didn't know that the whole genre of paranormal romance had arisen. And they said, well, yeah, our book club is reading your book this weekend. And I was like, oh, okay. And I did a couple of events with Romance Writers of America and stuff like that, just from people who, not that I had ever intended to write romances, but they said, oh yeah, monster boning is the thing now. And so I don't, it's as tastefully done as you can do interspecies bondage porn, I guess. I wrote a book in the late '90s called The Lust Lizard of Melancholy Cove, where, it's like 100-foot sea monster and this retired B movie actress, and they have a thing in which she uses a weed whacker as a um, sex toy, I guess, for any lack of any better term. And, that was way weirder than what goes on in this book. So, and that was, nearly 15 years ago. So if I would have lost, I already lost those people a long time ago, David. I'm not worried about losing them now. If you have a problem with and I said it in that book too, it was like, we just know that something happened and the weed whacker was used and the monster got off, and then they were just both sort of laying side by side smoking cigarettes, and that, we panned the fireplace in between. So, and it says right in that book, and what happened right after that was just none of your business. So that's sort of the way this one works too, is there's no sort of graphic description of what's going on. You just know that something really bizarre has gone on.
Hmm. Well, it's funny, speaking of that kind of bodiness in Shakespeare, when I was in college, Shakespeare in Love came out,
Mm-hmm.
and one of the girls in my class said, there's just like, for example, there's a random scene in that movie where Christopher Marlowe walks in on the theater owner having sex, and they have a kind of a casual conversation. And this girl said it's so out of place to have this sort of like random sex scene in a story about Shakespeare. And I was kind of like, that seems completely wrong to me. It seems totally, to me, it seems totally appropriate to have this sort of bodiness in Shakespeare, because Shakespeare was a really body author, it seems to me.
I think that I tend to not apply too much historical from Shakespeare's time, but when we're having this conversation, I think it helps to realize that, Shakespeare is basically writing in a time where there's pilgrims becoming a dominant political force in England. And they're going to be so straight-laced and so freaked out by anything that they're going to get thrown out of the straightest, most Christian nation in the world at that point and sent to the US, where they can turn into, school boards in Mississippi and stuff like that, I guess. And it just, I don't think it occurred to me until I was watching like one of the episodes of Blackadder, and they actually show the Puritans coming to someone's house, and so Shakespeare was working within a pretty strict format. I mean, his practices and standards people were tougher than probably they are in NBC, and yet he got away with a lot. There's a scene in a couple of scenes in Love, Slave or Lost where I want to say the character is Rosalind, but it might have been Rosamond, and she just keeps going on about a fool needs to hit it good, and it's clearly they're talking about spanking and sort of body, light S&M sex and so forth. It's clear that's what's going on. And it's only if you just had closed your mind at all to that possibility at all that you would miss that as part of what Shakespeare's having fun with. And the beginning of Othello, Iago yells out, "Even now, the black ram is tupping your white ewe," and screaming to Brabantio, who is Desdemona's father. And there's a lot of stallion and your white horse and all this black guy boning your daughter kind of screaming among the crowds and so forth, which at that time was probably about as bawdy as you could say it.
Mm-hmm. I guess I did want to mention that Othello and Merchant of Venice are two Shakespeare plays that deal a lot with prejudice.
Mm-hmm.
Could you just talk about how you chose to deal with that in your book?
Well, a couple of things. I wanted to sort of enlighten the reader a little bit about the history, the medieval history of the persecution of Jews all through Europe. And a couple of things happened. I mean, just prior to the setting of this book, all the Jews were expelled from France. They were priorly all the Jews were expelled from England, and this is in the 11 and 1200s. And in these different countries where Jews were just sort of forced to not live, they ended up in Venice because Venice had seen itself. Venice, because they had no land, they were not a fiefdom. They had been a republic. By the 1200s, they had already been a republic for 400 years with representative senators from each neighborhood. And, that's pretty progressive for the times. And they prided themselves very much on that. And so even though they weren't that great to the Jews, they were much better to the Jews than other countries had been. And so, and you see that in the play. The characters in The Merchant of Venice are they're dicks to Shylock. And that's happening almost 300 years after my book takes place. So I wanted to sort of give details to that. I wanted to show that, even in those times, the Jews were forced to wear, yellow stars sewed on their clothes. The thing that we think is, sort of originated with the Warsaw Ghetto and the Nazis didn't. It originated in the Middle Ages, and Jews were often accused of poisoning wells. In England, Jews were not allowed to own property. And so one of the reasons that you have the prefix gold in a lot of people's Jewish names is they became jewelers and held gold because they couldn't hold real estate. And they became moneylenders because they couldn't hold real estate. And so I didn't know that before I did research in this. And I, despite it's a comic novel and the biggest concern is I want to entertain and make people laugh, is I thought it would be interesting to them. How did Shylock become a moneylender? Well, he became a moneylender because he didn't have any choice. In Othello, they mention it's, there's sort of a conventional scholar wisdom that it is not a story about race. It is a story about an outsider, whether race is, the person who refers to Othello's color most often is Othello. But, Iago and Rodrigo, who are sort of the bad guys of the play, they are blatantly racist. Later on, Iago sort of develops and his hatred toward Othello. And he's sort of the most mustache twisting villain in all of Shakespeare. He and Richard III are sort of the two worst sociopaths in the entire Shakespeare canon, and it makes it fun. Most of, Othello may get the name of the play, but most of the lines go to Iago talking about, all the people he doesn't trust and how specifically he doesn't trust Othello. And it's almost incidental that Othello is black. And so it's addressed, and I think I just underline it a little bit and try to stay less about the race and more about the complete sort of ridiculous lines that people draw. And Pocket, because he's in the sort of the midst of the action, making fun of everything, he takes advantage of that. He points out to the Venetians and their own prejudice. And at one point, he has one of Antonio's men convinced that out on the Giudecca, which is the island where all the Jews are sort of not exiled, but they're forced to live. It's called the island ghetto of Venice, and it's still there and still called that. He convinces Antonio's men that he's trained thieving monkeys that only understand how to communicate. They only communicate in Hebrew, and they completely buy it because it's so foreign to them. No Gentile would ever set foot on the Giudecca. So whatever goes on out there becomes mythical almost. And that's the most important thing to the play. The prejudice is always about the other. And the parallels to, what we've just gone through in America, I originally wrote Fool because I thought that I wasn't hearing any political truth from anybody except comedians. And I thought that's what a fool does, and Jon Stewart and Stephen Colbert and Bill Maher and, on and on. Those guys are fools. Those are the ones that'll tell you, hey, this really nobody gives a fuck about Flight 370 and nobody really cares about, Benghazi and so forth. And that's true. But you're not going to hear that from people whose interest it is to foment these stories and froth up all these things that aren't really true.
I mean, so when you say, Stephen Colbert and Jon Stewart and Bill Maher are speaking truth to power in their capacity as comedians, and you are sort of in that same position, do you feel that your books change people's minds at all on these sorts of issues?
I don't think so. I think they're a little bit too far removed, to be honest with you, and I'm okay with it. I mean, I don't. I mean, I don't want to say a lot, but I have quite a few readers who will say, because I'm more outspoken in social media about my politics than I am in my books, and I'll have people, I love your books, but I don't agree with any of your politics, and I'm fine with that. You know, but it's not so much that I don't want to address those issues. I don't think that um, there's just no shelf life, David, to be honest with you, to political humor and fiction. You know, all my books, my first book came out in 1991, and all my books are still in print. And if I had really focused them on contemporary politics at the time, they would be sort of meaningless at this point. And so it's the way science fiction. I know a lot of your listeners are science fiction things. It's the way the Twilight Zone used to talk about McCarthyism and racism in the early 1960s. You know, and if you remember the episode where everybody looks like a pig, and the girl who we would think is gorgeous is, she's different, and sort of the whole "not one of us" theme that goes through like the body snatchers and so forth. That's basically science fiction commenting on current politics. But you can still watch those things today, and they're still enjoyable because they're not specific to the time. And as the people who were writing those, Richard Matheson and people like that, pointed out, they could do that when nobody else could. Nobody was their shields were going to go up as soon as somebody started to talk about something that they disagreed with, which is, much more manifest in people like Maher and Stewart and Colbert, than it is with people who write fiction. So basically, I just like I don't want you to have read Shakespeare to enjoy these books, but if you have, it enriches it, I think. You get some of the inside jokes, but if you don't get them, it should still be a fun story. That's the way I look at it. And I sort of feel about any political commentary. If you see parallels in there, if you get a perspective because you're coming at it from an oblique angle, that's great. But if you don't, you should still be able to enjoy the book.
I guess I'm just curious, what do you think about Colbert taking over for David Letterman?
I think it'll be interesting. I haven't seen Colbert out of character very much. But I'm old enough to remember when Letterman first started showing up and doing guest hosting on Johnny Carson, and he seemed so harsh compared to Johnny Carson. And then as time went on, he seemed just like the goofy guy that lives next door to you and swims at the Y. And I think that the seminal part of Letterman, of what Letterman was good at, is he never stopped enjoying being a goofy guy. And I think he's a nice guy. I think he's an ethically nice guy. And I think that Colbert is as well. I mean, he's clearly very, very talented. And if he can bring that talent and apply that talent in a format like The Late Show, the way he did with Colbert and the way he did as a correspondent on The Daily Show, I think it'll be terrific. I mean, look, we could have ended up with like Carson Daly or, Ryan Seacrest or, just some haircut doing it. And so I'm grateful that there's somebody that's got some talent. I don't get to see Letterman very often, but I like him a lot. I don't know what the politics was behind it. I don't know if they looked at the Scottish guy. I'm sorry, I'm blanking on it. It's still early for me, David. But I mean, I like him. Craig Kill something. No, not
Ferguson. Craig Ferguson.
Craig Ferguson, who I love, but he's so almost meta. He's just so sort of self-referential and talks about the process a lot, and I like that, and he's fun. But I think that that show needs to be a little more showy than that. But we'll see. We'll see. I like Colbert. I hope he does well. And I've had friends that have gone on the show and said that he just couldn't be a nicer guy when you meet him in person. So, I always hope for a lot of success for people who are decent human beings.
Well, you mentioned Richard Matheson. I actually saw that when you were first starting out, you wanted to be a horror writer and were influenced by Richard Matheson and Robert Bloch and authors like that.
Absolutely. Yeah, those were the guys I learned. Well, I don't want to give them responsibility for stuff I didn't learn, but when I was first getting the idea that I wanted to be a writer, those were the people who I read constantly. Everything I could get my hands on by Robert Bloch and Richard Matheson, and then the sort of, I don't want to say they're peripheral, but they're peripheral in my memory. But the guys who are writing stuff sort of on the edge of the Cthulhu mythos, like Frank Belknap Long. And I really liked Fritz Leiber a lot, but it was the short story guys who wrote these sort of twist ending stories like Matheson and Bloch that I really cut my teeth on, and Ray Bradbury, of course. And just every time there would be an anthology and one of those guys would have a story in it, I would just be, over the moon about it. And as craftsmen, they were brilliant. I think that anything speaks to how brilliant Matheson was is he's got to have sold more short stories to the film and television than anybody ever, And I don't know how many, you probably know how many Twilight Zones he wrote. I don't, but it had to be like close to half of them. So just a brilliantly talented guy that understood structure and convention and sort of took you into it in a real economy way. When you're trying to learn your craft, that was a great thing. The problem was that people laughed at my horror stories when I would read them at conferences, and I was like, well, wait a minute, maybe that's what I do. So, but I really thought that I was going to write sort of those sorts of stories when I was coming up.
Do you still read much in the way of kind of fantasy and science fiction short stories and anything like that?
Not much. I really don't. It's really a time thing. I mean, if I was just left to my own devices and I was doing some other job like I have often done, I probably would read more. But I don't read that many short stories just because I don't seek them out and I don't write them for economic reasons. I quit writing short stories a long time ago because I thought if I'm going to make a living at this, I have to write novels. And sort of once I was into the novel sort of groove, I don't compartmentalize well. I don't multitask well. If I'm working on a novel, I'm usually not working on anything else. And coming up with a short story takes just as long. And so I tend to read things that are either research for what I'm writing, of which there is a lot, or novels. But I read. I probably should read like the world's best every year, and I don't, because I used to really enjoy those. The ones that Ellen Datlow and was it Gardner Dozois?
Yeah.
How do you say his name?
Yeah, Dozois.
Yeah, they do a great job of sort of finding the gems, and I'm remiss in not actually reading them, but that's not their fault or the writer's fault. It's just that I just don't get to it. I've sort of almost lost my vocabulary for short stories, and that was so critical in learning how to write. Well, now you've made me feel bad. That's all I'm going to say.
Well, maybe this will cheer you up. We have some listener questions for you.
Okay, cool.
So Jason Wells asks, what is the best use of the phrase heinous fuckery most foul you've ever heard?
I probably used it. I don't want to be self-aggrandizing, but since I sort of had it in my vocabulary before anybody else, it probably had something to do with something going on with Congress or but it doesn't get used that much outside of me using it. It's not like you're sort of like flipping channels and all of a sudden, Ellen is going, oh, well, that's not very most foul. But it would certainly you probably couldn't get through a good episode of the nightly news without finding a very appropriate place to put heinous fuckery most foul in there. So, but you don't, to answer the question in the short manner, you really don't hear it used that often, but I'm all for promoting the phrase.
All right, cool. And so then Kelly Belly CA says, if you could be any Viking, living or dead, real or fictional, which one would you be and why?
Any Viking, living or dead? Well, that's like I can name like maybe what three Vikings. I would say that the head guy on the show Vikings. I don't even know what the character's name is, but but you know he seems to rock the hatchet pretty well. And Hagar the Horrible. I don't know. Tony Curtis and the Vikings from whatever that was made in 1959 or something like that.
Yeah, I think I would say Leif Erikson because that's the only Viking's name.
It's exactly. It's the only I can. And you're like, and Eric the Red was like, he was old school. So you want like the rock and roll revolutionary Leif Erikson Viking. Yeah, there's not. Unfortunately, the fact that their written language didn't really survive too much. There's not a lot of famous Vikings.
Okay, and so then Marissa asks, "Fuck socks. Why 3? I mean, why not 5?"
For the uninitiated, when I was writing a book called "You Suck: A Love Story," I was going to have this goth girl character, and at the time was sort of the golden days of MySpace, and what that meant was that everybody was writing blogs because really the format of MySpace was the blog, and all over the internet were these goth blogs. There were specific sites that were goth blogs, and a few of them still exist, but they're not nearly as prolific as they were in those days. And so I would pick up sort of the idiom from I didn't want to be like the creepy old guy hanging out where the goth kids were and eavesdropping, although I did that a little bit. And so I would sort of lurk like a creepy old guy on these goth blog chat sites and so forth, and pick up the vocabulary. And the thing that cracked me up is one kid one day, wrote, "Oh, fuck socks. I'm got to go to, the PTA meeting or something like that." And I thought it was hilarious. So I have my character use that. And then to do, people wanted me to start making merchandise. And so I said, okay, I'll do it, but only for charity because I don't want to be in the t-shirt business. And what should I make? What do you guys want? I'm doing this by request, so what do you want? And everybody said, oh, make fuck socks a real thing. And I happened to have a friend who had this company called Throx. And his big promotional idea was to sell socks in threes so that when the dryer ate one or whatever, over pocket that your socks disappear into, you always had a spare. And which I have to tell you, that never friggin' works. I have a bunch of pairs of Throx, which are these 3 socks in a package, and always 2 of them are lost now. So anyway, that happened. And so when it came time, and I thought, well, okay, if I make fuck socks, I don't know how to make socks. I don't know how to contact anybody to make socks, and I'll talk to Edwin Heaven, who invented Throx. And I said, can we make fuck socks? And he says, yeah, but I'm going to only do it if it's Throx. And that's how they ended up being 3 of them. Is he would only make them in threes, even though it was not economically really. And when we were selling them, and all the proceeds, in fact, went to MS research. But I was always encouraging people, if you buy 2, you end up with 3 pairs because there's 3 in a package. But I just got a whole bunch of what was the medieval version, which is what Pocket came up with, which are fuck stockings, and I just bought the last of those that were left. I'm going to try and give them away at my events for this book tour.
All right, cool. And then, after this interview, I'm going to be discussing the recent movie Noah with 2 Bible scholars. And I figure you're practically a Bible scholar yourself as the author of Lamb, which is being taught in seminaries now. So I was just wondering if you had seen that movie and if you have any opinions about it.
No, I really dislike Russell Crowe in the extreme. I mean, that doesn't mean, I'm sure he's a lovely Easter Bunny like person, and bless his heart. But I just don't like watching them, so I didn't go to see Noah. But let me say this: I'm somewhat skeptical about the flood, and I'm even more skeptical that all like 7 million species of animals were put in a box, of which the dimensions are incredibly specific in Genesis. So, and my thought in having done just the rough math is it wasn't a big enough fucking box. So
Yeah, it would need to be at least twice as big for that story to be plausible, right?
Yeah, I'm completely okay, and having written a lot of of sort of religions that start up, or sort of introduced myself into them to see if they'll make sense, and Lamb certainly the most specific. Um, I'm okay with, you know, a long time ago I said to somebody, a myth is just someone else's religion you don't believe in. I mean, what we look at as Greek myths or Norse myths, those were somebody's religion at one time. You just don't believe it. And that's sort of what I look at Noah as. It's, and there was, and I'm sure these guys you talked to this afternoon are going to tell you that prior to whatever extant copies of the Old Testament we have, that have survived, there were Greek myths of mass deluges, and those themes sort of occur through history over and over and over again. And then, Joseph Campbell, it was his life work to identify those themes, and he and Jung sort of said these are themes that are sort of hardwired into us. What I think Jung called them archetypes, and the entire science of folklore talks about motifs that exist in cultures that have never had any contact that we know of, or couldn't possibly have had any contact historically, and yet they rise the same with the same myth, like Lot and looking back and his wife turning to a pillar of salt. The Chinese have one where a guy is told, "Don't look back," and he looks back and his wife turns into a mulberry tree, and those motifs recur. So, in short, I'm sure it's fun to watch people get washed away by a giant flood, just like it is to watch them be crushed by giant sandworms. But I don't believe in either one of those things as having really happened.
Okay, cool. And so we're just about out of time. Do you just want to talk about any other recent or upcoming projects you've got going on?
You know what? I can't really think about much, but the fact that I've got about 6 weeks to tour for the Serpent of Venice, and I'm adapting the play of Fool for the stage with Joe Disher, who's a prominent stage director and an actor. And the next thing I'm going to be doing is a sequel to my book, Dirty Job, which is where the guy gets the job of being deaf and he runs it out of a secondhand store in San Francisco. And I just want to apologize that this interview wasn't that funny, because I leave it all in the books, you guys. It's all in the books. The books are much funnier than I am.
Yeah, great. And so, I mean, just the best luck with your 6-week book tour. And I just really want to thank you, Chris, for taking the time to speak with us today.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me, David. I really do appreciate it.
And that was our interview. So thanks so much to Christopher Moore for joining us on the show. And for our panel today, we'll be discussing the recent Darren Aronofsky movie Noah, based on the Bible story of Noah's Ark. And this will involve spoilers for Noah, so just be aware of that. And I'm joined today by my two favorite Bible scholars. So first up, we've got Robert M. Price. He's a former Baptist minister who holds PhDs in systematic theology and the New Testament. He's the author of such books as The Amazing Colossal Apostle, Inerrant the Wind, and The Incredible Shrinking Son of Man, and also the host of the podcasts The Bible Geek and The Lovecraft Geek. So Bob, welcome to the show.
It's great to be here, thanks.
And also joining us today is Richard Carrier. He holds a PhD in ancient history from Columbia, and is the author of such books as Not the Impossible Faith, Proving History, and the upcoming On the Historicity of Jesus. So Richard, thanks for joining us.
Glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
Okay, and so before we get to the movie, I just want to ask something. So, I mentioned that Bob also hosts a podcast on H.P. Lovecraft, so he's obviously a big fantasy fan. But how about Richard? Are you a big fantasy and science fiction fan?
Ish, yeah. I mean, I maybe not to the extent as Bob, although I am an H.P. Lovecraft fan, so we share that in common.
Bravo.
Yeah, and Bob's actually a fairly well-known author and editor in the field in terms of H.P. Lovecraft anthologies and stories and stuff. So people, if you're interested in Lovecraft, definitely look up Robert M. Price Lovecraft stuff. But so do you guys see a similarity between Bible studies and fantasy and science fiction? I mean, I've never been religious. And so when I go to see a movie like Noah, I kind of go into it with the same mind frame as I would go to see Clash of the Titans or something. It's sort of just another fantasy movie to me. Is this different for you guys, being former Christians and Bible experts and stuff like that?
Well, I do look at it exactly like Clash of the Titans, which I thought was terrific, and I love Noah too. And I couldn't help but think that all the people screaming about how unfaithful to the Bible this movie is, if there were a sect of literalistic believers in the Olympian gods, they'd have been screaming the same way at the other movies. And they don't own the copyright on this stuff. And nobody ever said it was supposed to be an exact transcript of the Bible any more than Lord of the Rings is going to be exactly like Tolkien's books.
Yeah, well, I mean, I can look at it from the perspective of like how faithful is it to the original, the same way you would do like if someone made a movie out of a book, like a novel or something like, Harry Potter films, you can talk about how they deviate from the text. But it's understood that people do that. But I can also approach it like just forget all of that and say like if I knew nothing about the Bible or the history of Judaism or any of that and I saw this movie, I would think it was a pretty cool movie. It's like this is like massively creative. Like who thought of all this stuff? Although I would have some nitpicks about the aesthetics, that sort of cinematic issues. I think some of the characters were poorly developed, for example. There are aspects of things like that, and there are certain cliches in it as well that are a little eye rolling. But so I could critique it as a film in its own right. I don't really. I'm not like offended that it reimagines the story. Although it's interesting that a lot of there's two different kinds of changes he made. I mean, one are changes that are actually based on the Apocrypha, like actual Talmudic legends and things like that the Jews had, because it's something the Christians assume they own this story, but it's really a Jewish story. And the Jews had their own books and other writings that aren't in our Old Testament, where they talked more about the story and had their own speculations and stuff. And he actually includes some of those in this, like explicitly. So he actually went outside the Old Testament, looked at other Jewish literature about the Noah story and included it. But then he also made changes that I think were very curious. They're almost a way that he's daring Christians to repudiate the movie, because by doing so, they'd be repudiating their own gospel. And I could talk about that if you're interested. I have a particular theory about certain things he did to the storyline.
Oh, I'd love to hear that.
Yeah, no, let's definitely get into that in a bit. I guess just first of all, do you guys have any other thoughts? Just how much did you enjoy the movie? Just as a movie, what kinds of things did you like or dislike about it, leaving the Bible stuff aside for a moment?
Well, I thought they did a really fine job of intricately plotting the thing so that earlier scenes were followed up by later ones in ways I had not suspected. And looking back, you could see these little narrative seeds planted, almost like Noah planting that seed from the Garden of Eden. And the various items in it I thought were striking and really interesting, like the idea that Tubal-Cain became almost a surrogate father for Ham, which is kind of interesting since Genesis implies Noah and Tubal-Cain are brothers. I don't think they mean to, but they're like the two different sources having to do with the children of Lamech, and one of them has Lamech's three sons, Mike, Robbie, and Chit. No, I mean Jubal, or however you say it, and Tubal-Cain, and the other has Noah as Lamech's son. And if they'd have been able to make that connection in the movie, that would have been even stronger, though there's a good reason they switched Noah to Seth's line, I think. And that, as Richard says, involves apocryphal pseudepigraphical material, because they're drawing on Sethian Gnosticism, as we find it in the Nag Hammadi texts, that humanity was divided into the Sethian and Cainite lines, and that when I think it's Ham says that we don't have kings, whereas Tubal-Cain brags about being king. Well, that reflects directly the Sethian self-designation as the kingless race. And they wanted, I think, to explain, or at least account implicitly for why Noah was not among the wicked. Well, because he was part of this pure, enlightened race. The Bible doesn't make that connection, but it makes sense in the film. So even there, the characterization of Cain was really interesting. It was almost like in the Star Trek episode where Kirk is divided into two by a transporter accident. You have the pacifistic but indecisive good guy, and the animalistic, lustful but courageous bad guy, and you kind of had two sides of the same character there.
Mm-hmm. Well, I guess maybe Richard, maybe we should get into this. What from this movie is purely invented by the filmmakers? What's from the Old Testament, and what's from the Apocrypha?
Oh gosh, that would be too much to discuss. But something to give you an example of something that they got from the Talmud, for example. And I noticed a lot of people were asking about what's this Sohar mineral that they're talking about that sparks and causes light, and even has at one point has a gun. The Tubal Cain shoots a gun with it. Mm-hmm. They went really creative with that, but the germ of the idea comes from in the Old Testament. It says God commanded Noah to build a Sohar for the ark so that it would be illuminated. And some people think that just means a window, but Talmudic rabbis speculated that Sohar was a magic crystal that would illuminate the ark from within. And so it looks like the writers latched onto that idea and then made it a metaphor for oil, because it was the mineral that the wicked people were destroying the earth to acquire, right? To build their cities and power their cities. So that idea that it was a mineral that the people were seeking, and so that's an invention of the writers of the film. But the germ of the idea comes from Talmudic legends about the Noah story, this idea of this magic crystal that would illuminate the ark.
Yeah, well, I mean, this idea of these wicked people destroying the earth is certainly a major feature of the story. And this movie, I had never imagined Noah's time as being like so much like Mad Max. I mean, that's really what it made me think of, right? What do you guys think of the way that the filmmakers chose to use this really post-apocalyptic science fiction imagery, I think, to portray this time?
Well, it's a neat idea because it's funny because this brings up a question that relates to your question earlier about how they changed the text and how they borrowed from things. Because the way they incorporated the Watchers into the story, both it's like gets a germ of an idea from other literature like the Book of Enoch, but then they changed it around a little bit. And when they started the film, they talked about the cities being giant and rapacious and devouring the earth. And so I thought that they were and the Watchers taught them how to build the cities and stuff. So they were implying that at that point that the Nephilim, who were the children of the Watchers and Earth women, according to the Genesis, the Watchers came down and had sex with Earth women and created the Nephilim, who were these immense giants who were hundreds of feet tall and were devouring the whole environment and devouring people and everything. And in the beginning, they're making it seem like the cities were the Nephilim. And I was like, oh, that's a really clever reinterpretation of that the cities are the children of the Watchers and that they're sort of metaphorically but in literally devouring the earth in that sense. But later on, then they make the Watchers play the role of the Nephilim in the story, because the Watchers are the actual people walking around on the earth that, have these physical bodies. That idea is based on the giants in Genesis and in Enoch. So they sort of conflated and played around with this idea.
Well, I mean, Bob, what do you think of these Watchers as these rock monsters? I mean, how are they having sex with anyone if they're all made out of rock?
Well, they cut that out.
Now the sin of the Watchers. And by the way, I think the reason they felt at liberty to conflate the two was that, at least by virtue of a pun, as often in Genesis, they seem to link the Nephilim as meaning fallen ones, whether it originally did or not, with the sons of God who mated with mortal women, so that you could say they both were implicated in the fall. So what the heck, why not make them the same? One of them is even called Semyaza, which is the name of the leader of the fallen sons of God in either the Book of Jubilees or one of these books.
It's in Enoch. You're right. Yeah.
And I thought it was real. Oh yeah. So they were originally seraphim, these flaming angels, and their sin was really more like Prometheus, that they took pity on the fallen Adam and Eve and tried to help them in their mess of a situation. And God apparently didn't feel that they were entitled to the help, and so he cut them off and imprisoned them in the rock bodies. Well, that I don't know if there's any biblical or apocryphal basis for that, but it does kind of reflect the Kabbalistic and Origenist view of Adam and Eve as originally having bodies of light and then being incarcerated in physical bodies after their sin. And so I guess they figured, well, same sort of a thing. When the Watchers fell at least out of God's favor, he incarcerated them too in these bodies of stone. And I love the idea. Now, it's a big, big thing in the Testaments of the 12 Patriarchs, the Book of Jubilees, First Enoch, and so on, that the Watchers did give humans help, but rather dubious help, because they taught women the use of the seductive and cosmetic arts and taught men the use of weapons. And so they apparently thought this was a good idea, and it backfired. And so they worked into that this fantasy notion of like an ancient pre-Diluvian Atlantis-like advanced technology. And as to the despoiling of the earth, that kind of makes sense, because Aronofsky's making the punishment fit the crime. Why is it necessary for the earth to be wiped clean? Well, the earth had been destroyed, they infer. Otherwise, God could have just sent them a bunch of poison lunch buckets with the children of Israel. But no, the earth has to be renewed like by a cleansing baptism. So I didn't think this was a painful import of some anachronistic environmentalism. It made loads of sense to me.
Yeah, indeed. And also because, the Genesis story actually says that the Nephilim were destroying the earth, that they were consuming everything. So it has a biblical basis. But also in the book of Enoch, it does say that the Watchers for their crimes are imprisoned in the earth, meaning a pit or something. But you could see how you could sort of play on that. Say they're imprisoned in earth, meaning rocks. The rock bodies. But also I found it interesting because it had this D&D, this Dungeons and Dragons connection, because what they looked like were elementals, right? They looked like earth elementals. Yeah. And the elementals were actually equated with the demons that were the ultimate children of the descendants of the Watchers in the New Testament, because it's Paul warns against worshiping the elementals, right? And so so it does all. I mean, it's a very clever way of using all of these different ideas and then coming up with a way to make them fit into their own particular story. So it's the sort of an amalgamation of their own ideas with these germs of these other ideas from other literature about the Noah story and about the cosmology and all of that.
Uh-huh. Well, I mean, Bob mentions this. Was it necessary for God to drown everyone? And certainly coming from my perspective as not being religious, this just seems like a horrific thing to do, right? And however bad these people may have been, drowning just seems like a cruel and unusual punishment, right? I wonder, do you think that God is portrayed as a sympathetic character in this movie, or is he sort of more of a villain in this movie?
Oh, that's interesting. I didn't really think of it in those terms, but what I mentioned before that I think some of this is designed to dare Christians to repudiate the movie in order to repudiate their gospel. Because there's two things to give an example of that is in the Apocrypha, the Jewish Apocrypha, the Watchers burn in hell forever, right? But in the movie, and this is a spoiler alert, they ask God for forgiveness at a key moment in the film, and they're forgiven and they get saved, right? Now, what is that? Yeah. That's the Christian gospel, right? So they actually made the story more Christian. And so for the Christians to repudiate the story because it went off text is to really force Christians to expose the fact that they're bibliolators, that they're worshiping the Bible, not the gospel. So I think that's a rather clever thing to do, because it kind of exposes a Christian as caring more about the literal word of the Bible rather than the actual meaning of the gospel and what they should be doing. And that's the other thing about Noah being, advocating a lifestyle of, poverty and simplicity and nonviolence, mostly. He does engage in some violence, which is more of a Jesus-like lifestyle than would normally be portrayed. But the key thing, though, is when Noah is going to kill the babies, because he thinks it's God's will to end the human line. And so he's got the knife poised above his granddaughters to kill them as babies. And he stays his hand, which of course is a sort of play on the Abraham and Isaac story, right? But that's another example where they took an idea from another story and sort of incorporated it into this one, but another story in the Bible. So it's not, unrealistic in that sense. But the key thing is in the Abraham and Isaac story, Abraham was totally gung-ho to kill Isaac, right? He was going to kill him, but God stopped him and says, no, I was just kidding. You don't need to do that. You just proved your faith by the fact that you were willing to do it, which is a horrible lesson, right? It's teaching someone that you should be willing to take human life in the name of God. That's like an awful lesson to teach. And yet that's the lesson that the Bible teaches. But what the writers of this film did is they have him stay his own hand because of love and compassion, right? So he has his own mercy, and he just can't do it, right? It's an interesting message to have. I mean, apart from being more Christian again, it also contrasts hugely with the fact that God murdered millions of babies, and compassion and mercy and love did not stop him, did not stay his hand. So you have Noah here actually being more compassionate and a better person, despite being the crazy fanatic that he was, than God. And I think that's contrast between that scene and the scene where they're sitting in the ark. I think they're even eating dinner or something while all the horrible screams of the people dying outside, right? So it's and you know, it's that contrast between God's lack of mercy and compassion and Noah actually exhibiting mercy and compassion is something they added to the story. That's something completely invented, but it's a story that Christians should actually get behind. That's like an improvement on the story in terms of the message of Noah refraining from violence out of love and compassion. That message is not in the Genesis story.
Brian Mattson, who is a theologian somewhere, we went to the University of Aberdeen. He did an interesting critique of the movie, which he dismisses as heretical, but it does a decent job of ferreting out some of these ancient non-canonical sources. He understands God to be the Gnostic demiurge, and that Noah is correct in discerning God's intent to destroy humanity. And I'm not sure. I don't think Aronofsky meant to go quite that far, because there are these broad hints that from what Methuselah and then Naamah, I believe her name is, say that, well, God did choose Noah to safeguard the animals and all that. And he must have known what Noah was made of, implying that God intended on somebody who would save the human race. And also there is this sensitivity to the outrage of killing all of these people. I mean, is every one of them bad? Was like the orc army in Lord of the Rings? They say no, because at one point Noah's wife says to him, "I was able to forgive you for the deaths of all these people," as if it was his fault. But this killing the two babies, I won't be able to forgive you for. So there's that sensitivity that, hey, this is a little rough. I remember once when I was a pastor, well, two odd things that this reminds me of. Years ago, I did a sermon called The Gospel of the Nephilim. And it tied in this story with the New Testament in some bizarre way. But the other thing was, during a service, and the youth choir sang this grotesque song about the flood story, and it's centered on God putting the rainbow in the sky, and the song was titled Rainbow Valentine. And I shouldn't have said this, but I got up and said, boy, with all these people getting killed, you should have called it Rainbow Epitaph or something. It's like the way the whole flood story is dealt with, for instance, in this terrible book, the Purpose-Driven Life. It's like Niebuhr once said that you should take the Bible seriously, but not literally. Well, this I think William Harwood aptly called the author a brain amputee. This guy, he takes the Bible literally, but not seriously. It just does not occur to him that this entailed the horrible deaths of all these people. And I think most people don't either, which kind of, to me, indicates that they are reading it as a myth, even though consciously they think it's history. The fact that as a myth, you're not really supposed to worry about all those people. They're just the bad guys, period. They're not really thinking of it as some kind of Auschwitz-like horror as it is. So it is kind of revealing, as Richard says, how it catches certain viewers and shows what they really do and don't believe.
Yeah.
Well, it's really interesting to me from the standpoint of a writer, is that you tend to think of the main character of a story as the character who grows and changes. And in this story, really, that's God is almost the main character of the story, right? Because he's the one who learns better. He's the one who grows as a character and changes his mind by the end.
I love the fact that, you know, how Noah is grudgingly willing to let the human race go on, though he's under no illusion that it'll necessarily be better. Well, that reflects God's realization in the Bible, though not in the movie, where when God puts the rainbow in the sky and makes the covenant, he says, "Look, he implies I kind of flew off the handle there. I promise I will never again destroy the earth just because the thoughts and intents of the heart of man is only evil continuously." It's like he knows this really didn't accomplish anything. This isn't going to scrub clean human nature, but he has learned not to react in such an extreme way. I could be reading that in, but I think it actually suggests that. And God remains silent in this movie pretty much, except Noah has visions. He takes his being from God, but it's Noah himself who undergoes the growth that God does in the book version.
Yeah, indeed. Although I disagree with the God learning that particular lesson in Genesis story. In the Genesis story, he actually says, "I'll never again destroy the world with water."
Yeah.
Right. And that's why apocalypticists now say, "Oh, he'll use fire next time."
Yeah. Yeah.
So I think it was more of that kind of thing. But yeah, in terms of the movie, God is a very mysterious character. You don't really know what he's on about. And that's the whole thing, is like it's open to interpretation. It's just like a statue. You're not sure what he's thinking or how much he's playing a role in all of this, or how certain characters' interpretations are actually reflecting God's actual will. I think it's interesting as science fiction to do that, to leave it like really uncertain, like you really don't know. And that's a powerful effect. And I think it's not so much a question as it's a problem we can solve. It's more of it's a little frightening that we can't solve it. And that's kind of part of the message, I think.
Uh-huh. Well, I mean, speaking of science fiction, one thing that kind of seemed like science fiction in this movie was that Noah has this magical snake skin thing that he wraps around his forearm that I took to be the shed skin of the serpent from the Garden of Eden.
Right.
What did you guys make of that artifact?
I looked into it. I couldn't find where that came from. So I think it's something that they made up. But why they made that up, where they got the idea from, maybe there's some germ in the literature, in the Apocrypha, that they're basing that on that I just didn't find. So I'm not really entirely sure what the idea of it was. Although it was interesting, I did see one commentator point out that that it contains some sort of wisdom. And you notice that in the beginning, when Noah's father wraps it around his arm and is about to touch Noah and sort of confer to him whatever magical power it had, he never actually completes the touch. He's killed before that happens, and Tubal-Cain steals the serpent skin. And it's only later, at the end of the movie, when Noah finally reacquires the skin and then touches his son, that whatever it's supposed to transmit is transmitted. And this commentator was thinking maybe that had something to do with some sort of wisdom that was supposed to have been conferred that Noah lacked during all the intervening part of the story. And it's only when Noah is able to wrap that skin around him that he's like freed from his drunkenness and his fanaticism and actually becomes a more wiser man. It seems to be that they were doing something about that, like that's part of what they were doing with that, but I'm not entirely sure, and I don't know where they got the idea from.
Me neither, though. I find I think you're right about the wisdom angle. That seems to be the case, but it's odd that it didn't originate with Tubal-Cain rather than Noah. I mean, that he hadn't had, well, that the Cainite line had not had traditional possession of it, since there is this fascinating story attested various places in the ancient world that Cain was the offspring of Eve and Satan. And so he would have been the half brother of Seth and Abel. And that this is why Cain was a murderer. And given that the snake skin would have been his father's skin, strangely enough, and it doesn't make as much sense to me that the serpent, being wise but crafty and evil, that Noah's line would have inherited this thing. So there are pieces of that puzzle I don't yet understand.
Yeah, me too.
Is there anything else you guys want to say about Methuselah and Tubal-Cain and the way that they were portrayed in the movie?
Well, I could inform your listeners that you might wonder, like, if you're seeing this movie and there's this scene in the beginning where they're doing like the past story, and Methuselah thrusts a sword into the ground and like it like vaporizes like 1 million people, right? And you're like, where on earth did that come from? That actually is another example of getting it from the Jewish Midrash. It's Midrash Akbir has this story where Methuselah wrote the name of God on the sword, and then it just says he slew 900,000 men 900,000 of the wicked in a single moment. And of course, it doesn't say exactly how. So they sort of interpreted that as, thrusting the sword in the ground, and this sort of fire blast just annihilated a million people in one go. Which is a very creative way to like reimagine that idea. But that's another example of a midrashic Jewish legend that they incorporated. So they actually were reading the Jewish literature about the Noah story and related stories outside the Bible, and so they are getting some of these ideas from there. And there might be pieces of it where I couldn't find the source, so they might even have. It would be interesting to have someone do a proper commentary on the text of the movie. Like, oh, this comes from here and this comes from there. And I'm sure the writers could tell you where they got certain ideas. So if anyone were to do a commentary like that, they would have something that biblical commentators never have, which is access to the author.
What do you mean? I talked to him this morning. I really love this backstory that I don't think I'm just hallucinating, but the business about Shem and Ham finding Noah passed out, drunk, naked, and they cover him up with the blanket and tell Japheth not to look, he's too young, etc. And then there's really no aftermath, whereas in Genesis 9, it's fragmentary. Something's missing because they've done something to Noah so serious that when he snaps out of it, he curses Canaan, the son of Ham, and says, your progeny will all be slaves forever. What the heck? What did he do? I mean, he wasn't even in the scene until Noah's curse. So the rabbis even ancient rabbis thought that something had been cut out of this. And because it was too offensive. And so what it seems to be, I think, is that that there were 4 sons, Canaan being the 4th, and that he had castrated Noah to unseat him as the patriarch, and that this is a Hebrew version of the Greek story of the Titan brothers, Kronos, Creus, Coius, and Iapetus ganging up on Uranos, who was the king of the Titans, castrating him, and then Kronos takes over. Well, the big clue is that Iapetus, it was the Titan worshipped by the Philistines, and it's the same name as Japheth, hardly as different as Carl from Charles. But also Ham is most likely Baal Hamon, who was called Kronos by the Greeks, and so you have 4 brothers originally in both, I think. 2 of them were explicitly the same, and this explains the violence against Noah. He was unseated, but he could get his vengeance in. And so, as is the case often, a myth has become a legend. A god has become an ancient hero, and I think that's what happened. And what is now? Why did they not have the violence and the curse and so on? Well, they switched it to Tubal-Cain, who, unlike in the Bible, stowed away on the ark, which I thought was brilliant. And he ambushes Noah and tries to kill him, but then Ham kills Tubal-Cain to save his father. Well, what they did was to take 2 variant versions of Cain that appear in Genesis, and switch him around, because Cain is also the same as Canaan in Genesis 9, and the same as Tubal-Cain, because these are different tellings of the same story. Cain kills his brother Abel. Tubal-Cain creates the weapons of iron and bronze that Lamech uses to kill one of Tubal-Cain's brothers, Jabal, like Abel. And so you have the Cain and Abel story twice, and in a sense, even a third time. So what they've done is to switch Canaan, one alternate version of Cain the murderer, with Tubal-Cain, the other one. And so if they didn't intend this, it's amazing luck, because all they've done is simply to include the scene, but in a different part of the story. It's just really fascinating to me. And this whole thing illustrates how through the Bible and with the pseudepigraphical material, the Midrash and the Talmud, the story, the myth grew in the telling, and this is simply the latest stage of the same trajectory of evolution, this movie.
I mean, one thing that has gotten a lot of discussion is the way that race is portrayed in this movie and how all the characters are white. Is there any biblical basis for saying what ethnic group these characters should belong to, and how does that fit in with the Curse of Ham thing?
Yeah, I mean, obviously Middle Eastern. They should all be Middle Eastern. But the interesting this is something where I think the writers handled the PR on this badly, or their own thinking was a little a slight bit racist in the sense that they were assuming that white was the default, which like they're not aware of the fact that that's precisely the incorrect assumption about the world. Because in actual history, of course, let's put it into the history of the fictional history of this mythology in Genesis. Other races don't exist yet, right? Because all the other races, the Asians and blacks and all of those people, are descendants of Noah, right? Because those races don't even exist yet. So then the question is, what races, or would there be only one race in Noah's time, or would there be multiple races, but they'd be different races than existed later? And that would be hard to portray cinematically. So it would make sense to have them all one race. But the thing is, it's a Christian and Jewish conceit that the original people were white, when we know scientifically the original people were black and that white people were developed later, right? So if I were doing this movie, I would have really pissed off the Christians by making everybody black.
Well, though
Make
the
Noah black.
doesn't the Genesis writer assume that they're all Semites, basically?
Oh, sure.
Because
Yes.
the
Yes.
names, even Shem, the father of the Semites, Ham, the father of the Hamites, which they thought included the Egyptians and all that. Because when you get to the table of nations, where it specifically says which son of Noah eventually gave rise to this and that, it's like they never heard of the Far East or Sub-Saharan Africa, much less the Western Hemisphere. So they were explaining the world they knew and just naively thought that was it. As to the Cain's curse thing, I believe that at some point there was a rabbinic distortion of this story, kind of like the Book of Mormon, where Cain's descendants are to be black because it's somebody's using it to legitimate enslaving blacks, just like Southern Presbyterians and others thought at the time of the Civil War. But as I understand it, that part of the story is trying to legitimate or by way of a false prediction, a prediction after the fact, of the Canaanites being enslaved by the Philistines, the Japhethites, and the Israelites, the Shemites, and that because it says that they will intermarry, but that Canaan's descendants or Ham's will be their slaves. Well, that's kind of what we see happening in the book of Judges with these stories about Samson, who's an Israelite, shacking up with Philistine women, and then, of course, in Joshua, the extermination of most of the Canaanites, but the enslavement of the Gibeonites, one tribe of them. So there it is kind of ethnic, but not in the same way. It doesn't involve sub-Saharan Africans. I don't think it was just typical opportunism. You make the Bible into a ventriloquist dummy.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, the connecting the Ham's descendants with black people, that is definitely a much, much later development. Comes after the Age of Exploration, when the whole idea of the difference between white and black people was created, because that wasn't even really a thing until the Age of Exploration thousands of years later. And so, yeah, you have two different possibilities here that you could work with. You could work with the conceit of the original authors, who were very ignorant and had their own sort of very ratiocentric view of how the world worked before them. Or you could try to subvert that by combining it with what we actually know scientifically. And it's interesting, in the movie, you notice that they play around with having the creation story in Genesis kind of map onto the scientific reality of cosmology and evolution, right? Because they even come just literally one film frame short of suggesting that people evolved from apes, right? They cut the story short, immediately, the little backstory there right before that happens. But they try to make it all fit science history. So they could have done that in the story of the film. They could have done that by making everybody black, for example, or making everybody ambiguously racial, right? By hiring a bunch of people who you can't really tell what race they are. So that would have been more interesting, I think, and would have been more in play with it. But if they went with the all white people thing, or the trying to make what they should have said by explanation is, well, that's the conceit of the original story. Like they'd had no concept that, and the time of Noah, that there would be anybody but Semites, like Bob says. So that's the way I would have explained it had I made that decision. Although I think I would have made a different decision for the film.
Something like you're suggesting, I think, is shown in the TV miniseries of the Mahabharata, where you had all these people that were they were one kind of I mean, India is incredibly diverse ethnically anyway, but they're all Indians originally, supposedly, and even of the Bharata clan, so they would probably be the same ethnicity. But they figured, really, this thing is intended to show people as people in a microcosm. And so they didn't have any compunction about having obviously different ethnicities cast as the different Bharata clansmen, and because this is really about human nature, and I like that. Or in Thor, the fact that Heimdall is black. I love that actor, Idris Elba. I mean, wait a minute, aren't these the Viking gods? Well, yeah, sorta, but the whole idea is we are the people. These are the gods. So it's not really a problem showing the diversity. So they could easily have gone that route.
Yeah.
How about this idea that all the animals in the ark were sort of in suspended animation for the whole trip?
Answers in Genesis. That's
pretty clever. Might as well use it.
Well, I actually checked this, and that, not the use of an herb, that makes sense, within the context of ancient biblical mythology, that you would have an herb that would do it. But the idea that the animals were put to sleep, they were put to sleep by God, according to Answers in Genesis. But the young Earth creationists in their website, Answers in Genesis, where they try to answer all the attacks against the Noah story. And one of them is how on earth could Noah have fed the animals? And how would they clean the ark of all the horrible feces and urine? And how would they keep the lions from eating the sheep? It's like there's a lot of big problems. And so a lot of these problems can be solved by just saying, well, maybe God just put them all to sleep. And so that's actually a modern fundamentalist idea. So it would be amusing to see a Christian bibliolator who insists on the text being accurately portrayed in the movie object to this, because it would be them objecting to their own apologetic.
Yeah, they don't mind adding all kinds of crazy things as long as it'll pull the fat out of the pie.
That's right. Yeah, it's a good point. Absolutely.
What I'm surprised is, given the incredible number of animal species and there not being nearly enough room, is that they don't posit that God used something like Brainiac's shrink ray that he used and to get the bottle city of Kandor to shrink. Oh, in fact, I think I have heard that without the Brainiac reference. That maybe he shrank them all down. Get out of here.
Yes, right. Or the Ark is a TARDIS. Yeah, that's the other. I'm surprised they don't go there, right? Why not?
See, I heard Darren Aronofsky quoted as saying that he sort of conceptualizes Noah as the first environmentalist. And some people have sort of said that this movie almost reads like a endorsement of vegetarianism or something like that.
Oh, well, no, that comes right out of the Bible, because
that's true.
They made a big deal about Tubal-Cain and his buddies eating meat. Well, according to the Bible, you weren't supposed to be eating meat, which doesn't mean people didn't do it. So they're figuring, well, that must have been one of the big sins. It's only after the flood that God says, okay, what the heck, you can eat meat, but it's very explicit. So Noah wouldn't, he wasn't like a Janist or something. He was just following the command of God in Eden. And this environmentalism, yeah, I think it is really great that Noah, in effect, becomes a sort of Earth first hyper-environmentalist, that the human race is a plague that must be destroyed if Earth is to be reborn. But finally he says, I can't do that. I've got love for fellow human beings. That's a really interesting moral dilemma that more people involved in this ought to consider. So I thought it was, insofar it is modernizing, it made the movie genuinely meaningful, not just entertaining.
Yeah, it's interesting. Also, especially that let's emphasize that one point, that this aspect of Noah that they're talking about actually just emerges naturally from the text itself, of the Bible, because like Bob says, that does actually say that the commandment to eat meat did not get issued until after the flood, right? So it actually says that Noah's family ate, vegetation and stuff, and there's no mention of them eating animals. So that actually fits the text. It's the idea of eating meat came later, so that the vegetarianism actually emerges from the text, and also this idea of environmentalism also does, because it was the wicked people and the Nephilim who were devouring and destroying the earth. That's actually in the text. It says that, and that's one of the commentaries against them, was this destructive, environmental destructive aspect of it. That's in the text. And so if you're going to have Noah in opposition to these people, it naturally, the natural inference is that he would be on the opposite side of that idea of destroying the environment, and therefore be in favor of protecting the environment. So that interpretation naturally emerges from the Bible text. So there really isn't any legitimate reason for Christians to be in outrage over that aspect of it.
It pops up on the other end of the Bible too, in Revelation, when the big judgment is about to strike. It says, now it's time for vengeance or judgment upon the destroyers of the earth. So it's not some alien concern being read into the Bible.
That's right.
Well, so I mean, it sounds like you guys are both, very positive about the movie and feel that it's pretty true to the Bible story. What do you make of the Christian response overall, which, so my impression is that it's been pretty hostile?
Well, it's bibliolatry, right? They're worshiping the Bible. They're treating the Bible as an idol that you can't deviate from the text. That whole idea is misplaced values, right? Even within their own worldview, it's misplaced values. Yes, obviously the movie deviates from the Genesis text in many ways. It adds things, it changes things. But reimagining the mythology, because the mythology it's designed to convey a point, right? It's not about the literal historical fact of it. It's the point of the story. And Bob gave the example earlier of this idea at the time of morally legitimating slavery by telling this myth about these descendants and so on of Ham, and somehow that being their legitimation. They told the story not because it was true, but because it suited their purpose of legitimating the institution of slavery at the time, of slavery of foreigners specifically, because there were different laws for enslaving Hebrews versus enslaving foreigners. So all mythology is like that. So the mythology, you design the story to convey some message, some value, some way, some idea you have about how to model society or to explain the way society is run. And so the idea of changing the story to reflect new values and new ideas and stuff is completely in keeping with the way that you would write mythology and retell mythology and change it. And I think Christians especially should be more comfortable with that, because their values have changed so much from the values that were trying to be conveyed by the original biblical authors, right? And there are many aspects of that in this. The idea that the Watchers gained forgiveness, the idea that you could ask God for forgiveness and be saved, the idea that compassion would compassion rather than God's command, but compassion itself intrinsic in a person would lead them to not kill a baby that he thought it was God's will to kill. I mean, these are new values. These are values that are actually Christian values today. At least let's hope that they're widely Christian values today. So it requires a rewriting of the mythology to convey the way our values have changed in the current situation that we're in. So the idea of rewriting the text but borrowing ideas from other ways the text has been rewritten by the Jews themselves, for example, and in doing your own creativity to it, that's a reverent treatment of mythology as mythology and the purpose of mythology.
I think a similar case, which also got a lot of outrage, was The Last Temptation of Christ, which took real liberties with it, as the novel, of course, by Nikos Kazantzakis had done. But even there, what they did was solidly rooted in the Bible, and the outrage at that movie was so ironic, because The Last Temptation is certainly the most orthodox Christian movie about Jesus ever made. The idea that the liar, lord, or lunatic argument that they use is, I think, deeply flawed, because it implies Jesus was not a genuine human being. If he had been, then to believe that he was God, whether he was or not, would have driven him insane. Right. And that's exactly what happens in The Last Temptation. No other movie ever took that seriously. And I think in a similar way, though not as much, the Noah story brings out unspoken issues that are inherent in this story. And it's just that sadly, a lot of people are very fragile in their beliefs. They don't want to risk rethinking anything because they've been told that if they do and they get it wrong, they're headed for hell. This is not the way to get people to think freely.
Well, I mean, speaking of other Bible movies, how do you think this compares to other Bible movies? Are there any other ones worth watching? I mean, really the only ones I've seen are Passion of the Christ and Life of Brian. I'm a big fan of Life of Brian, but...
Oh, yeah. Did I say something?
That would be my favorite,
visible? Throw him to the ground. Yeah, that is a great funny I'll be watching. Yeah, that is terrific. I think that is, of course, a satire on a lot of things, but it sure is hilarious in its attack on various foibles of religion. Some people thought that was blasphemous and anti-Jesus. Of course, it was not. Jesus is depicted in a very respectful way. And the Pythons even said they sat down with the idea of satirizing Jesus, but said, well, really, what is there to satirize here? And that Christians ought to be glad for that movie. Some of them are. I showed it in my church years ago. The other one, the Golgotha Chainsaw Massacre, I've never seen. I've never been able to bring myself to. What do you guys think of that one?
I didn't see it either.
Oh, I mean, it's it's an okay movie, but I mean, as I guess I first became acquainted with both of you guys in from the Brian Fleming documentary, The God Who Wasn't There. And in that movie, he has a minute by minute breakdown of that movie, in terms of how many acts of violence there are in each minute of it. And there's almost I think there's 4 minutes in the movie or something that don't have an act of violence in them. It's a really, like you say, it's a Chainsaw Massacre sort of movie.
Right. Yeah.
Now that's ironic because this is another one where they said, oh, this is going to be strictly by the book, just right out of the Bible, when in fact it isn't. It's based on Anna Katharina Emmerich's The Dolorous Passion of Our Lord Jesus Christ, this visionary hallucinating nun who was bedridden and came out of her fever dreams, and she wrote this huge, long novel with a whole lot of the detail. And Gibson, who's an ultra-conservative Catholic, was basing the movie on that, not the gospel text immediately.
Yeah, I'd be curious. I don't know if you've seen a lot of these movies, Bob. Has there ever been a movie depicting the gospel in which everything is depicted, like the cursing of the fig tree and the Gadarene swine, like killing 2,000 pigs? Because I would love to see a movie that actually took the text so literally that it actually shows Jesus casting demons into pigs and these 2,000 pigs rushing into a lake and drowning themselves. I don't know if any movie's ever portrayed a scene like that, but that would be amusing.
None that I've seen. Yeah, that's a good point. And then Jesus could turn to the camera and say, well, I guess that's deviled ham. But you're right. That would be fascinating. But that kind of thing, nah, we'd rather just have him healing people.
Yeah, right.
All right, I have a listener comment I want to read. So Anthony James says, I found it interesting that the Cain descendants were able to achieve industrial machinery, but that it did not occur to any of them to build a boat themselves. He says, I'm not certain this is a plot hole either. Aronofsky seems far too deliberate and detail-oriented to simply forget about something like that. My guess is he was trying to make a statement about the application of technology. But what do you think about this idea of Tubal Cain's people being able to make rocket launchers but not boats?
This is sort of like the professor in Gilligan's Island. The guy can make a radio out of a coconut, but he can't patch the boat. It may be, though, that he's taking the Eden creation story as the basis for this, where it says that it had not yet rained, that only a mist went up from the ground. Is that supposed to imply that there had never been a rainstorm before this one? I don't know, but it does say the windows of heaven were built into the thing for rain originally, but Genesis might be implying it had never rained because there was no rainbow yet. God places his war bow in the sky to indicate the war is over, and that's the rainbow. So they may be hinting that they hadn't sailed anywhere. They didn't need to, and because they had all these resources there, and they'd never had a flood before.
Yeah, they I guess I can't recall, but they never show an ocean or a lake or a navigable river anywhere, I don't think, in the movie.
Yeah, we're
I
told
could be
that.
wrong. I like because there were a lot of scenes in there that where they flashed through geography, but yeah, I mean that would be one thing. And yeah, I mean that would make sense if they'd never built boats before, for example, if they'd never had reason to. Um, and you know the Jews weren't known as a seafaring race, so it would make sense within your conceit of the mythology that they wouldn't have ships yet. But it also does make sense that oftentimes we have all this brilliant technology, but we don't sometimes think of the obvious thing, or we do something silly. We could have gone in a different direction, like the fact that, for example, if you go back to like Middle Ages and stuff like that, there's lots of things that they weren't thinking of that you'd think, why didn't you think of that? Like, why did it take the West, 50, 2000, 10,000 or whatever years to figure out a printing press? It's like this, the most obvious way to copy manuscripts and images and maps and stuff. No one thought of it. And usually the Chinese thought of it. And it's obvious in hindsight. But, there are
Or
a lot of technologies.
photography. The
Yeah,
ancient Greeks knew enough technology that had they put the pieces together, we could have photographs of Julius Caesar and Alexander the Great, but nobody thought of it.
Oh, you know what? I remember now. They do show they show several scenes in the movie of the continents, which interestingly
Yeah.
are like Pangea. They're like really not like 4,000-year-old continental arrangements, but like 400 million-year-old continental arrangements. So, like
Yeah.
they were showing the Earth like hundreds of millions of years before our time, which is interesting. And they did show oceans there, but I don't know if they show any seafaring going on. So
Yeah.
there were oceans in the movie, but I don't know if they ever like depict the idea that they ever used the sea for anything.
Well, I did hear Darren Aronofsky say that since there were no rainbows before the flood, who
Mm-hmm.
knows how he says that maybe the sky wasn't blue. I mean, who knows how the laws of physics might have been different if
Yeah,
in a world
sure.
with no rainbows,
Yeah, if you go into the conceit of the mythology, you can't talk about anymore what's scientifically accurate or inaccurate. I mean, you already have, a geocentric universe you're talking about. Although that's not what they show in the movie, they try to align the cosmology of the movie with actual modern cosmology, which so sometimes they try to throw science in there, but other times they have completely implausible things like a sword that can vaporize a million people by being shoved into the ground. It's not scientifically accurate at all. But
All right, cool. So we're running pretty short on time here. I did want to talk about, I mean, I mentioned that I was first acquainted with both you guys from the documentary film, The God Who Wasn't There. I don't know, did you guys just want to talk about that a little bit? I mean, why don't we say, Richard, why don't you talk a little bit about your book on the historicity of Jesus that's coming out later this year?
yeah, and you can say that's partly inspired by when I was interviewed for that film. I wasn't really convinced of the thesis at the time, but since then I've had fans support my work, and I've done a lot of research, and I am now pretty convinced that Jesus didn't exist. That in fact, the idea of a historical Jesus walking around Galilee was a later invention. Came about a lifetime later, or maybe half a lifetime. Or lifetimes back then, the average life expectancy was 48. So, and that's if you survived childhood. So people didn't live quite as long back then. But yeah, so I've done extensive research on this and have gathered together what I think is the best case by the standards that the scholars of the field would expect, right? Like, so they're often complaining that we don't cite enough sources, or we don't cite the current scholarship on certain things. So what I've done is I've done that so that they can't use those excuses anymore, and assembled the best methodological case showing that if we look at all the evidence, it really is better explained by supposing that Christianity originated with Jesus being an angelic figure that people only knew through revelations, and that this idea of making him a man walking around Galilee was something they did to allegorize the myth, to create a mythology, to allegorize their actual soteriology, their actual theory of salvation, and so on. And that this actually makes more sense of a lot of the odd features of the evidence that otherwise is really hard to explain on the traditional theory of how the Gospels developed, for example, or how Christianity originated, for example. And so that my book on the historicity of Jesus is the culmination of years of research in trying to build this case. But I'm not the first one to do this. There are many people who've written about it many books by Bob, our other guest, have already been advocating this for quite some time. It's just not been getting the attention that it should have gotten.
So if people are totally new to this, is that film, The God Who Wasn't There, is that a good place to start, or would you recommend something else instead?
Well, I would only recommend The God Who Wasn't There for maybe atheists and ex-Christians who want a feel-good film that kind of makes fun of religion. Because it's half and half. Half of it is about the Jesus issue, but the other half is about the problems with fundamentalist Christianity in general. And I think it would be offensive to some Christians who can't handle criticism. And for example, but I don't think anybody's done a like what I would consider like a really good scholarly documentary on this question yet. I've had nibbles from different production companies who want to do one, but no one's done one yet, as far as I know. Bob, do you have any?
Not that I know of either. I've been interviewed for 2 or 3 of these things that have not panned out. I'm sure somebody eventually will. It's just waiting to be done. It couldn't be that difficult to pull such a thing off. So I'm sure somebody will. There's these insane folks in Canada are making a documentary called The Gospel According to Price, if you can believe that, which is a whole bunch of interviews with some fat guy sitting in front of a bunch of books. And it was supposed to deal a good bit with the Christ myth theory. And over many, many hours, I did talk about that a bit, but they decided they were going to do a bit less of that than they planned. So I don't know how much that will deal with it, but it certainly wouldn't be adequate for this purpose. We really would need a much better extensive explanation of the thing. Somebody ought to get that going, because it would just be fascinating and could be done so well.
Yeah, I agree. It's the iron is hot on this. It's the time to do something like that.
Mm-hmm.
So what does The Gospel According to Price mostly deal with then?
Well, one big hunk of it took me by surprise. They asked me to put together a set of my favorite quotes on different topics. The Price Bible, they said tongue in cheek. And I didn't really know what the point was. But once I got up there, they put it in front of me and said, we want you. We were in a big chapel. They said, we want you to sermonize impromptu on the basis of these various passages. And from Ingersoll, Spinoza, a lot of different people. So I did, and I think it came out pretty well. Then there's a part where I'm going through a scrapbook and reminiscing about my checkered fundamentalist past. And there's parts where we're talking about different Bible issues and so on. I don't remember exactly, but they did quite a bit of footage. It's funny, they had it arranged so that part of it would be done in this huge, beautiful cathedral in Toronto. But once we got in there, the person who had given the permission and received the check and all that came rushing out. She had just looked me up on the internet and said, oh, no, we can't have this. So we can't be associated with this. So we had to go do it in a hotel room instead. It was really funny and a lot of fun. I'm not sure when it's supposed to be out. I don't think not all that far in the future.
Sounds pretty awesome to me.
I got a book coming out in September, supposedly, from Prometheus called Killing History, Jesus in the No Spin Zone. And this, of course, is a refutation of O'Reilly's
yes,
Jesus. And
very good.
Right.
All right. Yeah, that's been needed.
All right, cool. So yeah, and so I definitely recommend people check out the Bible Geek podcast that Bob does. It's one of my favorite podcasts. And let's see, Richard, if people want to learn more about you, what should they check you? Should they find you on Twitter, Facebook, whatever?
Just go to richardcarrier.info on the web. That's my website. You can find all the links to all my writings, my books, my blog, everything I do, biography, all of that stuff is there.
Great. And the Historicity of Jesus comes out when?
Expected in June. So let's fingers crossed on that.
You know, you should also tell them the big news that they have officially decided to rename the Bayesian probability theory the carrier probability theory.
I doubt that.
Maybe just want to explain that quickly?
Oh, yeah. Well, part of my project for the Historicity of Jesus was I realized that the methodology in Jesus studies is hosed, basically. And I'm not the only one to notice this. There are many scholars in the field have pointed out that the methodologies that have been used to study Jesus are hopelessly flawed. And so I realized, well, okay, because the first thing you do in a research project like this is method. Like, okay, what's the method? And so I realized, well, I'm going to have to figure out what would be a valid method. And I realized Bayes' theorem and a Bayesian way of doing history is the way to do it. And so my first book, which came out 2 years ago, which is Proving History, Bayes' theorem and the Quest for the Historical Jesus, which is basically showing how you can use Bayes' theorem to study all historical claims, in particular, historical claims about Jesus. And I wrote that book for humanities majors, so you don't have to be a math expert to get it. But some people still struggle with the math concepts. But nonetheless, the idea is that Bayes' theorem is a mathematical model for all correct empirical reasoning. And once you realize that, you can use that as a tool to analyze the criteria and methodologies that are used in history and other things, and figure out how to extract what the probability is of different facts based on what you assume or know about the ancient world or whatever historical period you're studying. And so I've been a big fan of this, promoting Bayesian, not just Bayesian history, but also Bayesian epistemology, that I think all of our thinking should be fundamentally Bayesian, fundamentally based on this Bayes' theorem. And so I have a reputation for being a Bayes fanatic and advocating it and talking about it in venues all over the place. And my book is the book for people who want to figure out how to think like a Bayesian without having to be without having to figure out complex mathematical equations and stuff. So Proving History is the book for people who want to know about Bayes' theorem from that angle.
Mm-hmm. And these flawed methods in Jesus studies you mentioned would be like the criterion of embarrassment or the criterion
yes.
of multiple attestation,
Yep.
sort of.
Yeah, I have 50 pages in my book, Proving History, on why the criterion of embarrassment is logically fallacious and does not actually work in Jesus studies at all.
Mm-hmm.
All right, great. Well, this stuff is so fascinating, and I could talk about it all day, but we're way over time here, so we need to start wrapping this up.
Sure.
But I just really want to thank you guys so much for coming on the show. This was just absolutely fascinating stuff.
Oh, it's great to be here, especially with Richard, whom I admire and appreciate. It's great to share the podium with him.
Ditto.
And that was our panel. So thanks again to Robert M. Price and Richard Carrier for joining us as guest geeks. And of course, big thanks again to Christopher Moore for being our guest today. Big thanks as well to everyone who's given us 5 stars on iTunes, including Ricardo Ferral. Ricardo writes, Geek's Guide to the Galaxy was on my long list of podcasts, then my short list of podcasts, then on my go-to list. Now I find myself anxiously waiting for new episodes and catching up on old ones. David Barr Kirtley is a great interviewer, and his SF knowledge goes way deep. I miss John Joseph Adams, but his occasional appearances are good, and the panels are always top-notch. So thank you, Ricardo, for that great review. And of course, a special thank you to all of our crowdfunders, including longtime supporters Jason Lind, George Turcotte, and Spectrecraft Computing, and new supporters Obsolete Press, crowdfunder number 73, and Laura Dirks, crowdfunder number 74. Laura also just became the latest listener to be making monthly contributions to the show. So thanks, guys. We really appreciate it. To learn more, visit our website at geeksguideshow.com and click on crowdfunding. All right, so that was our show. So thanks everyone for listening, and we'll see you next time.
The Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is a production of Wired.com. For more information about the show, visit geeksguideshow.com. To learn more about your host, visit davidbarrkirtley.com. Music and voiceover produced by yours truly, Jack Kincaid. If you enjoyed this program, tell your friends. If you didn't enjoy it, tell no one. Thank you for listening.